but this month we've come to baptism. And so this month, all the sermons are going to connect somehow, some way to baptism. And as we kind of celebrate 4th of July, a holiday devoted to freedom, I think it would be appropriate to remember the greatest freedom offered, freedom from sin given by God. Frederick Douglass was an American abolitionist and ex-slave. After escaping from slavery, he went on to write some of the most powerful works against slavery and really help illustrate the life of a slave from their perspective. And Douglass realized the emancipated enslaved people needed advocates to speak on their behalf. He just has an incredible story. He gave many speeches, wrote several books. I think he wrote 3 autobiographies. And I think reading one of his autobiographies was perhaps one of the most eye-opening events of my life. He shows the cruelty of the African-American slave trade, but also showed the endurance of the human spirit. He showed how through ambition and hard work, anything can be overcome. He refused to identify as a victim and would become someone great no matter how the world treated him. He showed the need for every person to preach and practice equality in their country. He showed how no group of people is inherently lesser. And I encourage everyone to read some of his writings because our world needs it right now. But one of his most unique writings was a speech he gave on July 5th, 1852. He delivered an address to the ladies of Rochester Anti-Slavery Sewing Society. This speech eventually became known as "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." One biographer called it perhaps the greatest anti-slavery oration ever given. Now understand the context of this speech. He's speaking about 4th of July, and there must have been a great irony to 4th of July in those times, because this was a holiday celebrating freedom during the days of slavery. And so here he is, an ex-slave, an abolitionist, giving his perspective on the 4th of July. And that's what makes it so unique. I have some excerpts from it that I want to read. "Citizens, your founding fathers made good the resolution. They succeeded, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you therefore may properly celebrate this anniversary. The 4th of July is the first great fact of your nation's history, the very ring bolt in the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny. Pride and patriotism, not less than gratitude, prompt you to celebrate and to hold it in perpetual remembrance. I have said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. So indeed I regard it. The principles contained in the Declaration of Independence in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, at whatever cost." And so he starts off by explaining that the principles in the Declaration of Independence are wonderful principles. But then he goes on to critique America. He says of the Founding Fathers, they were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but that they knew its limit. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out the more as we contrast it with these degenerate times. And then he gets into his real critique, how a slave views 4th of July. Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mourning wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view. Standing therefore identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine, I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on the occasion, I will, in the name of humanity which is outraged, in the name of liberty which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce, with all the emphasis I can command, everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. And so he just lays into it and says that America is committing a grave sin. And the end of his speech goes this way. Allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope. While drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence by the great principles it contains, the genius of American institutions, my spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of this age. He has a very balanced view. While he is willing to admit there are wonderful, great things that America was founded on, he is not afraid to proclaim these terrible sins that America was committing at the time due to their slavery. And yet he says, but I have hope that we can abolish slavery. He believed in the equality that America was built on, for we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You see, for the freeman, that statement was reality, but for the slave, that was a prophecy to be fulfilled. When the nation would realize that that statement, that freedom is given by God, is incompatible with slavery or segregation or discrimination or any other form of racism. And this 4th of July, we celebrate the freedom of this country and praise God that slavery is done with. We can celebrate the freedom we have obtained, and we can even celebrate the freedoms not yet obtained that we will obtain, but that require blood, sweat, and tears. And none of this freedom would have been possible if not for the gospel, enlightening the eyes of the founding fathers and the men who built this country, who realized freedom is one of the greatest things that God has given us. People like Frederick Douglass, who understood the gospel and from it understood the importance of freedom. God's gospel liberates people of sin. It opens their eyes to the slavery that they're underneath. And people like the founding fathers and Frederick Douglass realize this because of God's word, which exalts freedom. And so through God's law, people know sin. They know their enslavement to it. Through the gospel, they learn the way in which they're liberated from the tyranny of sin and receive eternal life. Because the truth is, slavery is well and alive today. And I don't just mean literal slavery. We do have that in our world today, and we need to abolish it. But I am talking about spiritual slavery. Christians today must be spiritual abolitionists. We must be like Frederick Douglass, who exalted the blessings of life, but also denounced the evil of slavery and sought to free people from slavery. The slavery we denounce is an even more heinous slavery than racial slavery, if that could even be possible. But it is slavery to sin. We denounce the slavery to sin that condemns people's souls to hell. We must teach people the reality of slavery to sin. Frederick Douglass said this. He said, "No man can put a chain around the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end of the chain fastened to his neck." He understood slavery is more than just being a literal slave. Every slave owner was a slave. You don't need to have a master to be enslaved. And I like how he says, very simple, I didn't know I was a slave until I found out I couldn't do the things I wanted. That's the essence of slavery. To be unable to do what you wanted, to be powerless. And so how is a person a slave then? How is a person powerless? How is it a slave owner who has plenty of power is powerless? John 8, Jesus says some amazing words. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." This is an amazing passage. I encourage all of us to memorize it. This is incredible. If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That is so important. Being his disciple, abiding in his word, knowing the truth sets a person free. But then the question is, how are they set free? In order to be set free, what does that mean? It means they're not free. How are they not free? And that was the question the Jews had. So the Jews listening to him asked the question. They answered him, "We are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free?" Right? And I want to take a second to admit that this is just a hilarious reply. They say, "Well, we're the offspring of Abraham. We've never been enslaved." Have you ever read Jewish history? I mean, they were enslaved lots of times, right? In all their different wars, every time they lost a war, the conquering nation basically was in charge of them. And so nations like Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Rome, one of the biggest major events in their history was the Babylonian exile, where the Babylonians defeated them and took them into their country for 70 years to be slaves. What are you talking about? Or even in this time right here where Jesus is talking to them. They are underneath the oppression of Rome. The Roman government is in charge. And so they are basically, maybe not quite slaves, but they are under the bondage of the Roman government. This is a hilarious reply, but that's because they were so blinded by their pride, their racial, ethnic, national pride. This is a bad type of patriotism, where they're thinking to themselves, "We are so amazing. Nothing ever bad has ever happened to us." No, you got that wrong. It's like, we're not slaves at all. We're the best nation there is. One thing is they're thinking of political freedom, right? And I think there's a great connection to our country today. Because when we talk about freedom in our country, freedom, 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 that is the anthem of our nation. Whether you love it or hate it, that's the anthem of our nation. We keep preaching freedom. But the problem is, we keep thinking politically. I know how to make America great. I know how. Spiritual freedom. Listen, I don't care what Trump says. I'll make America greater. You want to make America greater than it ever has been? Go baptize someone. That's what we need, because our focus is very much like the Jews' focus on political freedom. Yeah, we have the freedom to protest, vote democratically, speak our mind, challenge evil in a court of law, and those are incredible blessings. But what good is it if we are just slaves to sin? Even when you can do everything you want, you learn, you still might be a slave. And this is what Jesus says. "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. A slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." I want to hear a politician say that. There are people today who live their lives and do not realize their own powerlessness. They sin and they think they could stop sinning anytime they want. You see it in the extreme example of like an alcoholic who says, "I can stop whenever I want." Well, you know what? That's the kind of attitude of all sinners. They say, "I could stop whenever I want," when the truth is, they can't. People don't realize how entrenched they are into sin. They think it's their choice. They think that they're following their desire, but the truth is, they are a slave to their desire. And I have this amazing quote I wanted to share with you that really expands on how if you practice sin, you're a slave to sin. C.S. Lewis, he's the author of the Chronicles of Narnia. I'm a big fan of his Christian writings. At one point, he was an atheist and converted to a Christian, and he wrote lots of Christian writings. He has this quote that really explains what it means to be a slave to sin. No man knows how bad he is till he has tried very hard to be good. A silly idea is current that good people do not know what temptation is. This is an obvious lie. Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. Do I need to read that again? Because that's powerful. Right? No man knows how good he is until he has tried very hard to be good. Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. He says, after all, you find out the strength of a German army by fighting against it, not by giving in. You find out the strength of a wind by trying to walk against it, not by lying down. A man who gives in to temptation after 5 minutes simply does not know what it would have been like an hour later. This is such a good quote. This is why bad people, in one sense, know very little about badness. They have lived a sheltered life by always giving in. I want to read that again. This is why bad people, in one sense, know very little about badness. They have lived a sheltered life by always giving in. One more. We never find out the strength of the evil impulse inside us until we try to fight it. And Christ, because he was the only man who never yielded to temptation, and is also the only man who knows to the full what temptation means. The only complete realist. C.S. Lewis brings out this point that you don't know how hard it is to be a good person until you try. You don't realize that being an evil person and doing every little thing you want is actually a sign of weakness. I mean, I feel like we kind of say it all the time. Someone punches you in the face, what's harder? To punch them back or to walk away? It's so hard to be good. It's so hard to fight your own desires. And yet we don't think of strength in those terms often. And C.S. Lewis brings it out so well that when you practice sin, you are giving into desire, and that is a matter of weakness. You are not fighting your desire. You are a slave to desire. You are a slave to sin. You don't know what it's like. You don't know the challenge that it is to be good. You don't know how hard it is to be sinless. And Jesus, because he never gave in to temptation, this is such an amazing point he has. Jesus, because he never gave in to temptation, knows completely everything that temptation has to offer. Because Jesus never sinned, he defeated Satan. He experienced the full strength, the full power of Satan. Satan took every opportunity he could to get him to sin. And yet Jesus, because he still never sinned, knows completely how strong Satan is, and yet he was stronger. Everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. Jesus is the most credible person to make that claim. He is the person who knew no sin. And if Jesus never knew sin, because giving into temptation is easy, fighting temptation is a struggle. You know what that means? If Jesus never sinned, it means every single day for him was a struggle. It means every single day he fought. Every single temptation he resisted. He never gave in. He is the opposite of the average person. When a person is struggling with temptation, they feel the power of sin pulling them in. And a lot of the times, we know how it goes. Sometimes you ask, why am I fighting so hard? You're like, all right, I'll just give in. All right, I've waited long enough. All right, just this once. To give in to sin is the easiest thing you can do. And that is why sinners are powerless. And when you are powerless, you are a slave. You know, people of the world, they delude themselves into thinking this is their choice. Maybe you're in that boat. Hopefully you're not. You convince yourselves, well, this is what I want to do. You convince yourself, well, my desires are part of me. And so you never have to test your strength. You never have to see whether you could say no. We may not have become full heathens and gone into the excesses of sins, but we allowed sin into our lives. We humans, we're weak. We lack the strength not to live lives free of sin. We lack the strength. We are weakened by the flesh. We did not live up to God's law, and we were condemned by sin. And Paul, his writings are very similar to what Jesus has said. So I'm going to bring up Romans 8, verses 3 to 4. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us. The point of bringing up why we are slaves to sin is to show us why we need the gospel. Because you do not realize you need to be saved from sin until you realize you are a slave to sin. And so Paul here is bringing up, listen, God did what you could not do, what God's law couldn't do because you were too weak, because it was weakened by the flesh, because we were weak. We were inherently weak. We failed to live like Jesus. And so Jesus had to come and do what he did so that we could be saved. And so that when he came in flesh, he condemned sin. That's a unique phrase, condemning sin. He overpowered sin. He removed the power of sin. He condemned the condemnation. He punished the punishment. He killed death. He did it because we failed to do it, and he loves us. It reminds me of a bill that is so egregiously large you can never hope to pay it. I knew a gentleman who once went to business school, and he burned out. It was kind of a prestigious college. And he started working in low-level retail, but over his head were these huge student loans that were just hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he worked for minimum wage. And every day he worked, he earned less than the interest accrued on his loans for that day. He was literally deeper in debt every day he worked. He was a slave in that situation. He had no control. Imagine being in that kind of position where you have this massive debt hanging over your head that you're never going to be able to pay, and then someone, out of the kindness of their heart, writes a check for that amount. That's the gospel. Jesus paid the debt you owed, but you would never be able to pay, because our God is a God of freedom. You see this all throughout the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, it's realized spiritually. God says this constantly. He says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That whole story when Moses brought the Jews out through the Red Sea, he brought them out of slavery. And in the New Testament, we find Jesus doing the exact same thing, bringing us out of slavery, but in a much deeper spiritual way, out of spiritual slavery. Jesus said, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. But the problem is, a lot of people don't realize they aren't free. We have to recognize the bondage of slavery. We have to proclaim to everyone, hey, there is the slavery that is well and alive today, and it is slavery to sin. And I think the best text on this idea of slavery to sin and freedom from it is Romans chapter 6. And I want to look at Romans chapter 6. Romans 6, verse 16. Do you not know that if you present yourself to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? And so he's just basically saying, listen, if you obey something, you're a slave to that thing. If you act like a slave to something, you're a slave. When you obey something, it becomes your master. And so he kind of says, listen, you're going to be a slave either way. Which way do you want to go? Do you want to obey sin, and that goes to death? Or do you want to obey obedience, which leads to righteousness? Right? He just presents to you two choices. Like, you're going to be a slave either way. You're not going to be able to do what you want either way. Are you going to follow your own desires, and it leads to terrible consequences? Or are you going to follow God's desires, which lead to great things? He continues in saying, but thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. And so God kind of presents that binary choice Slave to sin, slave to God, right? And to make that transition from slave to sin to slave to God, you got to be obedient from the heart to that standard of teaching. That is exactly what Jesus said, didn't it? Jesus said, "Become my disciple, abide in my teaching, know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And Paul's saying the same thing here. Obey this teaching, the truth, and it sets you free from sin. And so Paul has spent a lot of time in the book of Romans so far, chapters 1 to 5, how he's saying we sinned and we're separated from God. But it's by our faith in Christ we are saved. It's not a matter of works of the law of Moses or works of any kind that save a person. They are saved by the work of Jesus when he died on the cross. Peace with God comes through accepting the sacrifice of Jesus. That is the truth that sets you free. And Romans 6 gets to this point. I think Romans 6, 7, and 8 are all about freedom from sin. But chapter 6 especially hits that moment where it says, this is when you became free. This is when you obeyed that teaching that set you free. This is your liberation. And he touches on that moment when you come into contact with the sacrifice of Jesus. Baptism. The moment when you are set free from sin. The moment when you learn the truth and the truth sets you free. The moment when you have become obedient from the heart to this teaching. And I'm not going to read all these verses, but I encourage you to do that. I'm going to look at chapter 6, verses 1 to 14. I'm giving you guys homework, okay? I'm going to grade it later. Don't doubt me. Verses 1 to 14 of Romans chapter 6. I want you guys to read that this week and see what I'm saying here. Because it's just a great description of what baptism is. And not even just baptism, about what the whole concept of being converted to Christ. Right? About you having faith in that teaching, you being obedient to the gospel. That's what baptism is supposed to be. Just an obedience response. That's what it's supposed to be. And so our conversion, our baptism, our rebirth is this. Romans 6, just some points. Verses 1 and 2, he says, how can we who have died to sin still live in it? Baptism is a death to sin. Isn't that a unique statement? Have you ever heard someone saying, that person's dead to me? You ever heard someone say that? What does that mean? That means you don't want anything to do with that person. And so when you say, I'm dead to sin, you say to sin, you might as well consider me dead. I don't want anything to do with you, sin. It is rejecting sin. It's a moment where you say, I am dead to you. Did we make that commitment to die to sin? Is that commitment in our life still well and alive? Have you had a moment where you said, you know what, I'm done with sin. Sin was going to send me to hell. Sin put Jesus on the cross. I don't want anything to do with sin. That's what you do when you come to Christ. Baptism is a uniting with Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. Verses 3 to 5 talk about, don't you know all of us who have been baptized all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into his death. His death, burial, and resurrection, where you're in baptism, you commit yourselves dead to sin, you're buried in water, you're raised out of water, and spiritually you are connecting with Jesus in that moment. You are connecting with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. There's symbolism going on of what you're doing, right? You are connecting with his death. You are connecting with his burial. You are connecting with his resurrection. And Paul says, well, if you died with Jesus and you're buried with Jesus, then it only makes sense that you're going to live with Jesus. Verse 6 to 7, baptism is being set free from sin. He says our old self was crucified. Our old sin was eliminated. He says, verse 7, the one who has died has been set free from sin. Paul got as clear as he could be. Where do you die? You die whenever you're baptized. When you connect with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. If you have died, then you are set free from sin. Right? And so those who have died to sin, those who have made this commitment to get away from sin, those of us who have connected with Jesus, leaving sin behind and coming to Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, you have this newness of life where you are free from sin. And there's the freedom we need to be celebrating. Verses 8 to 11, baptism is receiving life. He says, well, if we died with Christ, we're going to live with Christ. When Christ died, what happened? He was resurrected. He came back to life. Same thing with us. When you die with Christ, you live with Christ, right? You connect in His death. You connect with His life. He says, death no longer has dominion over you. Death doesn't have any power over you. The bondage is gone. The chains are released. The slave master is cast away. So consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God. Verses 12 to 14. Baptism is a commitment to righteousness. And really, probably the biggest thrust of the chapter is that if sin was going to send you to hell, if sin separated you from God, and God sent His Son to die because of sin so you could be freed from sin, why would you go back to sin? Right? I mean, in the same way, could you imagine how silly, insane, crazy, and foolish it would be if after slavery was abolished, there were people who said, no, I decide I want to stay a slave? How crazy would that be? If someone who lived as a slave their entire life and they were freed and they decided, no, I'm going to stay a slave. That makes no sense. And that's the kind of craziness it is whenever you accept the sacrifice of Jesus for sins so you can be forgiven of sin and then you go back to sin. That doesn't make any sense. It is illogical. It is ridiculous. It is foolish. It is a whole bunch of other words that probably we shouldn't be saying in a sermon. It is just silly. You know what I'm trying to say? I don't like calling people stupid, but you know. And so whenever you're freed from sin, we're good? Okay. And so if you've been freed from sin, why would you go back to sin? And that's the point he's really trying to make. He's saying, don't present yourself as obedient slaves to sin. You've been freed from that. Present yourself as slaves to God, who will treat you wonderfully. You see, this is the paradox of freedom, right? We call this country the land of the free. We talk about how the USA is free, but freedom doesn't mean freedom from rules, right? You say, oh, we're the land of the free, but you can't do this. Well, freedom doesn't mean you don't have rules. That's anarchy. There's a big difference between freedom and anarchy. Freedom requires order. And so freedom always comes with laws and order. And so in order to truly be free, you must restrain yourselves from the things that limit your freedom. Being free from sin doesn't mean you have permission to sin. Being free from sin means you have to avoid the things that restrict your freedom. Being free from sin means you need to avoid going back to the slave master. This is why we have God's laws. God's laws teach us how to be free. Teach us how to avoid the things that put us in bondage in the first place. Not just being free from sin, but living a life free from sin. Jesus said, abide in my word, be my disciples, know the truth, and you will be set free. You see, in this context, death occurs when a person is baptized into Christ, into his death. When you're united with Christ in baptism, you are freed from sin and you begin a new life. Because bringing it back to the very beginning, people don't realize how powerless they are to sin. They are like an alcoholic who says, I can stop anytime I want, when we all know the truth. They can't stop the penalty from sin. They can't free themselves from sin, but they don't know. One more quote, and I'll be done. Sometimes the devil allows people to live a life free of trouble because he doesn't want people turning to God. Their sin is like a jail cell, except it is all nice and comfy, and there doesn't seem to be any reason to leave. The door's wide open, till one day time runs out, and the door slams shut, and suddenly it's too late to get out. I love that analogy of sin being like a comfy jail cell. Why would you want to leave? Jesus says, abide in my word, be my disciples, know the truth, and the truth will set you free. We have to open our eyes to understand that slavery is well and alive today. We have to be spiritual abolitionists like Frederick Douglass saying, listen, we got to get rid of this slavery today. We need to tell people, listen, you want to improve the state of this world, you need to know the truth, and the truth will set you free. We need to explain to people, you need to be set free from sin. You need to unite with Christ. You need to accept his sacrifice, his death, burial, and resurrection, and connect with him there. Being spiritual abolitionists, preaching to people that slavery must be ended and that Christ died to end our slavery to sin. And on this 4th of July, as we celebrate the wonderful blessings we have, remember the greatest blessing we have. And don't forget to share it with the people you know and love.